Taehyung in critical condition after an attack, until Jungkook discovered something unexpected. The city of Seoul never really sleeps, but that night it felt unusually still, like the calm before a truth no one was ready to face. Taehyung had just wrapped an intimate late-night interview at a luxury hotel in Gangnam. No screaming crowds, no swarm of cameras, just a carefully arranged schedule designed to keep everything quiet. The lobby smelled like expensive winter, notes of cedarwood and vanilla drifting from invisible vents. His boots clicked softly against spotless marble as he adjusted his coat and prepared to leave through the private exit. It was supposed to be another controlled night, another safe route, another invisible wall between him and the world. Then a voice split the silence. "Get down." Taehyung barely had time to turn. The balcony glass above him detonated into a violent spray, shards ripping through the air like 1,000 tiny daggers. The pain hit first, explanation second. A burning, unforgiving shock bloomed in his side, deep and wet, stealing the oxygen straight from his lungs. His body folded mid-motion, knees slamming into the floor, palms catching nothing but cold marble and spreading blood. Chaos exploded around him. Security guards shouted into radios, medics sprinted in, hotel guests screamed, but Taehyung heard it all like it was happening underwater, muffled, distant, unreal. Blood pooled beneath him in an irregular, brutal halo. The scent of iron was overwhelming. His breaths came thin and staggered. Something was wrong. Something was deliberate. Something had finally reached him. Across the city, Jungkook was mid-take in a studio shoot when the call came. The words were simple, but they struck like blunt trauma. Taehyung been attacked. He's being rushed to Seoul National, ICU. Jungkook didn't ask for details. He didn't ask how bad. He didn't even speak. The phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor, but he was already moving before the sound finished landing. The studio doors banged open behind him as staff called after him, confused, alarmed, unprepared. But Jungkook didn't look back. Not once. The hospital elevators were too slow. The antiseptic air clawed at his throat. A nurse tried to block his path. Family only. Jungkook stepped closer, eyes burning with something sharper than protocol. "I am family," he growled, voice rough, low, dangerously sincere. "He's all I've got." Inside the ICU, the machines hummed like heartbeats engineered by fate itself. Taehyung lay unconscious, skin pale like winter paper, bruises darkening around his eyes, bandages soaked but stable for now. The doctor spoke in clipped medical caution. The wound was close to an artery, a miracle he hadn't bled out before the ambulance arrived. But Jungkook wasn't listening for medical poetry. He was listening for the spaces between the words, the gaps, the guilt. The reasons Taehyung never talked about. A chair scraped against the floor as Jungkook sat beside him, staring at the only movement that mattered, Taehyung's chest rising and falling unevenly, fragile but defiant. Hours passed. No movement from the bed, no movement from Jungkook either. Then a nurse rushed in. The heart monitor spiked erratically. "He's crashing." The words came like a closing trap. "We need to stabilize. Step back, sir." Jungkook was pulled out before his body even processed compliance. The door slammed shut in front of him. The silence that followed was louder than sirens. HYBE's most reliable security lead, the man who never panicked, arrived breathless, coat unbuttoned, a tablet in hand. His voice was low, controlled, sharpened by urgency. "He was followed before the attack," he said. "Not just tonight, for weeks." Jungkook didn't blink. "Show me." The footage played. Taehyung entering a hotel bar earlier that night. A man in black seated in the far corner, face blurred but intent unmistakable. The way he turned when Taehyung laughed. The way his body tracked him like a radar locked on frequency. The way he left before the glass shattered, before the blood, before the scream that came too late. "Not random," he said quietly. "No," Jungkook replied, "targeted." Meanwhile, outside the ICU corridor, Tiang, Taehyung's older cousin who had always played the role of family watchdog with fire-edged temper, blocked Jungkook's path, jaw tight, eyes red, fury barely contained. You left him alone that night, didn't you? The accusation cracked like a bone splintering under pressure. Jungkook exhaled once, slow, controlled, bracing for impact. Don't, he said. Not now. Then when? Tiang snapped. After he dies. The words hit like gunshots wrapped in grief. Jungkook surged forward, grabbing Tiang by the collar, voice low, shaking, venomous with self-hatred. You think I don't hate myself enough already? Silence fell thick and brutal. Before Tiang could fire back, a nurse stepped in, gloves stained with reality no one could sanitize anymore. Family of Park Taehyung, she said. He stabilized. For now. Police will arrive in 20 minutes. The pause between for now and police was the first cliffhanger the night offered. What did the attacker want? Ye asked. The nurse hesitated, not from ignorance but from fear. He left something, she said, a note taped under his coat. Jungkook's heart dropped not because of the reveal but because he already felt the shape of it, the silhouette of a truth too heavy for a first chapter but too inevitable to avoid. What did it say? He asked. The nurse swallowed. He'll never wake up if he knows the truth. And that was the first time that night that everyone realized the war wasn't the attack itself. It was what came after survival. It was memory. It was truth. It was everything they had been avoiding for years. It was the moment Jungkook realized that protecting Taehyung wasn't just about shielding his body anymore. It was about shielding his story from being rewritten, replaced, or erased. But this time, there was no script left to hide behind. And the silence that hung between them wasn't fear anymore. It was ignition. The detectives arrived exactly 20 minutes later, badges clipped to their coats, eyes scanning the ICU corridor like they were measuring liabilities, not lives. By then, Taehyung had already been moved to a guarded wing within the intensive care complex. Not public, not VIP, something quieter, deeper, sealed with more intent than hospitality. Jungkook was waiting when they stepped out of the elevator, arms crossed, face taut from exhaustion that had long burned past emotional display. He looked like a man who had been sprinting against time, and time had barely let him win. Jungkook, the male detective said, reading from a file that already looked too thick for a simple assault case. You were present at the scene earlier tonight. No, Jungkook said, voice flat. I got the call while filming. And you ran without asking questions. Jungkook almost laughed at that, but the sound that came out was sharper than humor, edged with disbelief. Do you think I needed to ask? The female detective narrowed her gaze. Most people ask. I'm not most people. Silence flickered between them, not awkward but electric, like something unsaid was already shaping the room. He leaned against the wall behind Jungkook, tablet still in hand, every bit the man who saw details others missed and paid for it with sleep. Tiang was seated across the corridor, nursing a bandaged hand from punching walls that didn't deserve blame but absorbed it anyway. No one interrupted. Everyone listened. The detectives exchanged glances. We have reason to believe, the woman began, that the attack was not random. Jungkook didn't move. Go on. The assailant knew his movements. No crowd, no forced entry. The glass came from above, but it was targeted. That implies surveillance. You finally exhaled. We already confirmed that. You have footage. Yes. Official. No. The detective stepped closer. Then you know what that means. It means I don't care if it's official. I care that it's real. Another pause, another spark. We're opening a high-priority investigation, the male detective said. This is bigger than assault. This is stalking, attempted homicide, and possible coordinated intimidation. Jungkook looked at him directly. Then you better find who coordinated it. We intend to. Good. Because promises don't heal bullet wounds or glass shrapnel. Then came the question they didn't want to ask but had to. Do you know anything about a note recovered from his coat? Jungkook's jaw tightened. What note? The one taped under his jacket. the one the nurse refused to read aloud. Jungkook turned toward the ICU doors as if they could answer for themselves. She said he'll never wake up if he knows the truth. And what truth would that be? Not mine to say, Jungkook replied. Not until he says it himself. The detectives paused again, but this time it wasn't suspense. It was assessment, calculating compliance thresholds like they'd been trained to see pressure, not people. You're protecting him, the female detective said. I'm not protecting him, Jungkook corrected. I'm protecting his right to speak before someone else speaks for him. Because Taehyung had always been the man others narrated around, not the man others narrated for. You straightened his stance. We've already increased security. How much? Enough to slow them, not enough to stop them. Tiang finally looked up. Slow who? Jungkook didn't answer because he already knew the detectives would. The female detective spoke. The people who want the note buried, unread, unspoken. The same people who want truth to die in the margins. Jungkook stepped closer, voice lowering to something that made even detectives flinch. Then don't bury it, don't margin it, investigate it. We will. Faster. Because momentum isn't built from survival alone. It's built from reaction. Public reaction. But that was the danger now, wasn't it? The nurse stepped back in then, chart in hand, gloves changed, but expression unreadable. He's stable again, she said. 5 minutes of visitation. Jungkook didn't hesitate, he entered. Inside, the machines were calm again, rhythm restored, tone like a metronome counting seconds he couldn't afford to waste. Taehyung's hand was cold when Jungkook took it, but his pulse was steady enough to whisper defiance beneath skin. Jungkook leaned closer. You hear them out there, don't you? Taehyung didn't answer because his body was still fighting for coherence, not confession. They're saying it's surveillance. They're saying it's not random. Jungkook leaned closer. It was. Taehyung's fingers twitched once, just once, enough to confirm life, not agreement, not narrative surrender. Jungkook whispered again. I need you to wake up. I don't care if you're angry. I don't care if you want space. I care that you live long enough to tell your side. Because silence was never his strength. It was his prison. A knock sounded on the ICU glass window. Yi again. There's more, Yi said quietly when Jungkook stepped out. The police think it's external, but external doesn't explain the note's phrasing. What phrasing? Yi hesitated, then swiped the screen and showed him the translated text. He'll never wake up if he knows the truth. The wording wasn't medical. It was personal, psychological, programmatic. It sounded like someone who understood trauma, not tactics. Jungkook exhaled sharply. Whoever wrote this didn't want to kill him. They wanted to break him. Break the man. Keep the brand intact. The detectives were listening now. We'll need statements, the male detective said. You'll get them, Jungkook replied, after he wakes up. The detectives looked at him for a long time, and if he never does, he will. And if you're wrong, then I'll bleed with him in the headlines. Because this wasn't about logic anymore. This was about loyalty sharpened into strategy, truth sharpened into ignition, and ignition sharpened into war. But wars don't start with gunfights. They start with questions. And that question was hovering now, in Yi's eyes, in Tiang's silence, in the nurse's hesitation, and in Jungkook's refusal to let anyone else speak first. The question wasn't who attacked him. The question was who wanted the note hidden. Because the attack was the headline. The note was the trigger. And triggers always point backward before they explode forward. Jungkook looked toward the detectives again. Find the man who wrote the note, because the attacker wasn't acting alone. He was acting late. And late, Yi whispered behind him, is where the real story always begins. The detectives turned and left. But Jungkook didn't move. Because for the first time that night, he realized that Taehyung surviving the attack wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that Taehyung still had the will to wake up despite someone trying to weaponize the silence around him. That was the difference between assault and annihilation. One wounds the body. The other negotiates the soul. And the negotiation had already begun long before the glass shattered. Long before the blood pooled. Long before the scream came too late. Someone had been writing instructions into Taehyung's pain for longer than anyone realized. And Jungkook had just stepped into the first chapter where those instructions would finally start demanding answers from everyone, not just test subjects. But answers require witnesses. And witnesses require survival. Taehyung had done the hardest part already. Now Jungkook had to do the second hardest part. Make sure survival turned into testimony. Not tragedy. Not myth. Not PR calibration. But truth, delivered with the cadence of someone who refuses to let the world treat trauma like marketing copy anymore. That night, the hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a place of reckoning. Because truth delayed is truth weaponized. And weaponized truth doesn't whisper. It detonates. But only when the right witness refuses to look away. Jungkook didn't look away. Not then. Not now. Not anymore. The first 48 hours after the incident passed in a blur of controlled panic and suppressed headlines. HYBE had deployed additional internal security, but the perimeter of protection still felt like it was built on borrowed time. No press statement had been issued, no official narrative released to the public, yet rumors were already circulating in encrypted fan forums, private group chats, and small media circles that thrived in the shadows of celebrity incidents. Silence, it turned out, was no longer containment, it was fuel. Jungkook barely left the ICU corridor. He had stopped checking the time because time had stopped behaving like a measurement and had started behaving like a threat. Nurses rotated shifts around him, doctors updated charts without eye contact, and you delivered information in low-frequency bursts, as if speaking too loudly would summon another disaster. Tiang had taken up post outside the guarded wing, arms crossed, eyes hollowed by sleepless vigilance. He didn't talk much anymore, but the silence around him had turned different, less accusatory, more molten, like iron heated too long but not yet shaped into a weapon. Taehyung remained unconscious for most of those hours, drifting in and out of chemically induced rest designed to stabilize his internal injuries. The machines hummed a steady rhythm, clinical but ominously ritualistic, like they were counting seconds until a verdict rather than recovery. The wound had been sutured and bandaged, swelling monitored, infection risk mitigated. But the bruising on his ribs and the microfractures in his breathing pattern suggested a deeper story than blunt trauma. This was impact with intent, force applied by someone who didn't just want to hurt a man, but wanted to interrupt his coherence. At hour 49, Taehyung opened his eyes. It wasn't cinematic, it was anatomical, a return of consciousness like a paper-thin door unlocking after someone had leaned against it too long. His pupils adjusted sluggishly to the sterile light. His throat was dry, voice absent. Jungkook was already standing when the movement registered, but he didn't speak immediately. He waited, because this time, Taehyung deserved to land first, not react. Taehyung blinked once, then again, slowly turning his head toward the corridor glass, as if the world outside the ICU was a memory he needed permission to face again. His hand lifted weakly, trembling, searching for gravity, not heroism. Jungkook stepped closer, lowering himself to Taehyung's eye level without blocking the view. "You don't have to talk," Jungkook said quietly. "Just stay awake." Taehyung's lips parted, but the sound came out like static scraping against sand. One syllable, rough, almost invisible. "Who?" Jungkook exhaled once, bracing, not from fear but from recognition, because that was the question everyone had been orbiting without daring to articulate. "You tell me when you're ready," Jungkook replied, "but there's something you need to know." Taehyung's brows furrowed weakly, pain carving micro-expressions across a face the world had always interpreted too quickly. Jungkook continued. "The police think it was external surveillance, a stalking attempt that escalated." Taehyung's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not denial, not agreement, a third category, recognition dipped in exhaustion. "There was a note," Jungkook added, "under your coat taped inside." Taehyung's pupils flickered with something sharper than sedation could dull. He didn't speak, but his body language answered like a paragraph. Jungkook continued. "The nurse refused to read it. She said you'd never wake up if you knew the truth." Taehyung's breathing hitched once, just once, a fracture in the inhale, a glitch in the machine's calm. "They weren't talking about medical risk," Jungkook said. "They were talking about psychological damage." Taehyung closed his eyes briefly, not surrender, but computation. Processing pain like a private language no public translator should ever have access to. Then ye entered the room without knocking, because this was no longer a protocol chapter. This was escalation. "They're here," ye said quietly. "Who?" Jungkook snapped, already turning. "The police and someone else." The corridor outside the ICU had shifted temperature. Detectives stood by the glass, but beside them was a man in a charcoal coat, face obscured by a mask and glasses. Not threatening, not anonymous, curated anonymity, the kind designed to send signals without fingerprints. "He's from a crisis containment firm," ye said, "contracted by an external stakeholder. They want to negotiate the release of the note." Jungkook's eyes narrowed. Release or burial? "Burial," he admitted. Taehyung opened his eyes again, slower this time but clearer. Voice still absent but coherence rebooting. Jungkook turned back toward him. "You know who that is?" Taehyung blinked once, slow, heavy, accurate. "Yes." The ICU machines didn't spike this time, but the air pressure in the room did. "Then stay awake," Jungkook said, "because we're not letting anyone else edit the margins anymore." He exhaled again, quieter. "They don't want to kill the brand, they want to mute the man." Taehyung's fingers curled slightly against the bed, tremor stabilizing into intent. Molten silence shaping itself into a sentence. "Not again," he rasped. And that was enough to confirm the war wasn't the assault anymore. It was the censorship. The negotiation of who gets to narrate pain first. Jungkook stood then, turning toward the corridor glass, eyes burning like studio lights recalibrated into interrogation beams. He didn't shout, didn't dramatize, did CTR optimize his tone, because truth didn't need marketing anymore. It needed defiance. "We'll talk," Jungkook said, "but we're reading the note aloud, in full, unedited, when he can stand long enough to witness his own story." The man in the charcoal coat didn't move. But momentum did. Because containment firms don't negotiate when witnesses refuse to look away. And Taehyung was awake now. Not healed, not choreographed, but conscious enough to finally claim the first right the world always tried to steal from celebrities in crisis. The right to speak before someone else speaks about them. That right was rebooting. And the reboot had begun. The negotiation attempt was shut down before it even found a shape. The crisis containment representative never got his meeting. The police, however, did. But even they could feel that this case was slipping out of the jurisdiction of ordinary logic. Taehyung waking up had changed the stakes. Not because he could speak, but because his consciousness meant the story could no longer be managed by proxies who specialized in silence. Taehyung's voice still hadn't fully returned, but his awareness was sharp enough to unsettle anyone who stood too close without intent. The doctors warned that full conversations would have to wait. His lungs needed recovery, his ribs needed rest, his body needed time. But what they didn't warn was that once Taehyung opened his eyes to the truth again, patience would become a secondary priority. He had spent years having narratives built around him. This time, he was determined to make sure one would finally be built by him. You remained the relay station for information. Jungkook remained the anchor of reaction. Tiang remained the wall of silent violence, guarding the corridor like a man who had finally stopped asking who to blame and had started asking who to stop. At hour 60, the hospital wing was sealed into a near-media vacuum, but the internet outside was already storming. Small Korean outlets had begun sniffing the edges of the incident, foreign fan translators were assembling theories like forensic hobbyists, and speculative headlines were sprouting faster than official ones could be drafted. HYBE hadn't issued a statement yet, but they were preparing one now. Because this time, the silence had lasted too long to be strategic. Jungkook finally stepped into the administration office of the guarded wing, not to negotiate, but to intercept. He didn't request a briefing. He demanded one. "We're releasing the real sequence," he said, "not the PR sequence." The PR director, Mr. Han, a man who had survived years in the entertainment industry by turning crises into syntax, looked up from his desk, exhaustion carved into the folds of his blazer. "Jungkook," he said slowly, "we can't drop attempted homicide into a headline without a suspect." "You already have one," Jungkook replied. Mr. Han froze. "We don't." "You do. You're just calling it unconfirmed because it's inconvenient." He stepped forward and placed the tablet on the desk, flipping it toward Mr. Han. The footage played again, the same masked man tracking Taehyung's movements hours before the glass shattered. But this time, he zoomed in on the detail no one wanted to acknowledge. The reflection in the window. Not the attacker's face. The accomplice's silhouette holding the phone that recorded Taehyung from the upper balcony. Mr. Han leaned closer. "That could be anyone." "It wasn't," he said. "The angle is deliberate. It was sent from a device that synced briefly with a tower near HYBE's corporate district minutes after the attack." The implication landed like an unscheduled truth. Mr. Han's face drained, because external stalking is one genre, internal surveillance is another. One sells danger, the other sells betrayal. Jungkook crossed his arms again. "You see why the nurse hesitated now." Mr. Han exhaled. "Army will implode." "They're already imploding," Jungkook countered. "Just not in the right direction yet. Rumors without truth hurt more than truth with impact." Mr. Han looked toward the ICU corridor through the office blinds. "And Taehyung." "He knows," Jungkook said. He corrected him softly. "He remembers that's different." Because memory isn't confirmation. It's evidence that refuses translation. Jungkook stepped closer. "If we don't read the note aloud, someone else will leak a rewritten version of it, and rewritten trauma becomes slander before it becomes sympathy." Mr. Han didn't argue again, because this time the threat wasn't backlash, it was narrative theft. The hospital door opened again. A doctor stepped in. "He can handle 10 minutes, that's it." Jungkook stood immediately. "We're reading it to him." Inside the ICU, the lights were sterile but softer now, dimmed slightly for biological mercy. Taehyung looked fragile, but his eyes had the clarity of a man who had survived shock twice, once from glass, once from recognition. Jungkook sat beside him, unfolding a small plastic-sealed evidence bag containing a folded paper note recovered from his coat. He didn't hand it to him. He read it for him slowly, clearly, without embellishment, without dramatization, without marketing cadence. "He knows you better than the cameras ever did, and that's why you have to stay asleep." Taehyung's breathing hitched again, not panic but recall. Jungkook continued reading. "He can't protect you from the part of yourself you never speak about." Another inhale fracture. The world loves the myth of you, but myths don't testify, humans do. Taehyung's fingers curled again, stronger this time, nails pressing faint crescent marks into the blanket. Jungkook lowered the note. You want me to stop? Taehyung shook his head once, small but sovereign. Jungkook continued, voice steady now, delivering the last line like it was carved by someone who studied vulnerability like a map. And the map always leads through the quietest door, the one labeled family. The room fell silent again, but this time silence wasn't intimidation. It was revelation. He leaned against the wall, whispering once more, not for suspense but for truth's cadence. The note wasn't a threat. It was profiling, Jungkook said. And profiling, Yi replied, always means the attacker was the second person in the sequence, not the first. Taehyung exhaled a long, shaky breath, not resignation, but ignition delayed too long. He looked toward Jungkook, then toward Yi, then toward the ICU ceiling like it was finally time to stop treating survival like a quiet miracle and start treating truth like a public responsibility. Because Part 4 was no longer about the wound. It was about who studied it long enough to write instructions into it. And the instructions had a voice now. Taehyung's voice. Still healing, but no longer silent. The decision to read the note aloud triggered something far more seismic than a press release ever could. The moment the words were spoken in Taehyung's presence, the invisible architecture of containment around him cracked open, not violently like the glass had, but psychologically, like a seal dissolving after too much pressure. He was awake now, but waking up didn't mean recovery. It meant exposure. It meant vulnerability with witnesses. It meant the narrative would finally have a source that could breathe and respond. Jungkook knew the world outside the hospital doors would not wait. The digital ecosystem of K-pop media thrived on immediacy, emotional volatility, and momentum built from microshocks. But this story wasn't going to be micro. This story had arterial weight. It had emotional inertia. And inertia, once disturbed, moves in only one direction, forward, faster than permission. He entered the ICU again later that evening, carrying not just data but consequence. His expression was a quiet alert system that never malfunctioned. We intercepted a leak attempt, he said. Jungkook looked up from his chair, eyes bloodshot but locked. Rewritten note. Worse, Yi replied. A fabricated statement claiming Taehyung staged the attack to exit his contract. The accusation hit like a second assault, this time aimed at reputation, not flesh. Jungkook stood immediately, chair scraping back. That narrative dies here. Yi nodded once, sliding the tablet toward him. Already flagged, but it means someone internally is panicking enough to deploy misinformation, not negotiation. Tiang, who had been standing outside the ICU door listening without breathing too loudly, finally stepped in. So they want him dead in the headlines if they can't have him dead in the lobby. No, Jungkook corrected. They want him useful, mute, unconscious, owned by interpretation, not testimony. Taehyung shifted slightly on the bed, his body still tethered to pain, but his awareness was no longer soft clay. His eyes flicked toward Jungkook, then toward Yi, then toward Tiang. A triangle of people who had finally become witnesses instead of schedule footnotes. They think trauma is leverage, Jungkook said quietly. But trauma without a voice is their leverage. Trauma with your eyes open is ours. He scrolled again, pulling up another data point. The tower ping near HYBE's district wasn't accidental. It belonged to a burner device that synced briefly with an internal employee's company-issued cloud access token. Tiang's jaw twitched. Name. Not yet confirmed, Yi said. Then confirm it, Jungkook replied. I'll hold the headline until you do. The ICU nurse entered again then, clipboard steady, but tone cautious. His vitals are stable enough for emotional stress, apparently, she said. But his ribs aren't stable enough for rage. Rage isn't what we're asking from him, Jungkook said. We're asking for recall. Because recall is quieter than revenge, but sharper than rumor. Jungkook leaned closer to Taehyung again, lowering his voice like someone calibrating truth, not volume. Do you remember anyone upstairs before the glass broke? Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He inhaled once, shallow but deliberate, then whispered like someone stepping onto thin ice that had held him anyway. Two shadows, he rasped, one loud, one quiet. Yi and Jungkook exchanged a look, because loud shadows throw stones, quiet shadows write notes. The quiet one knew the code, Taehyung continued weakly. Knew the tape, knew the route, knew me before the interview did. Jungkook's eyes narrowed. You mean someone who had proximity before opportunity? Yes, Taehyung breathed. Tiang looked toward the corridor blinds again, fury recalibrating into strategy. Then the attacker was hired to wound. The accomplice was hired to erase intent. Erase evidence, Yi corrected softly. Erase testimony, Jungkook corrected sharper. Erase me, Taehyung whispered, quieter but devastating. Jungkook shook his head immediately. They don't get to erase you, not after surviving a marble floor and misinformation on the same weekend. He scrolled again. The leak attempt originated from a device logged into a cafe near Hapjeong Station. Jungkook looked up, distance from HYBE. Far enough to claim deniability, close enough to deploy staff. Tiang stepped toward the door. Then it's not geography, it's choreography. Someone staged distance like a safety clause. Exactly, Jungkook said. Taehyung closed his eyes briefly again. Not unconscious, but sequencing memory into something coherent enough to weaponize truth without rewriting it into defamation. Two shadows, Jungkook repeated quietly. One wound, one motive. The nurse checked his chart again. 5 minutes left. Jungkook didn't waste it this time. You don't owe the world a statement yet, he said to Taehyung. You owe yourself consciousness long enough to not let anyone else draft your pain into marketing syntax. Taehyung exhaled again, slower, steadier. I'll stand, he whispered, just not tonight. Then tonight we hold the perimeter, Jungkook said, standing up. And tomorrow, Yi added quietly, we hold the evidence. And the day after, Tiang added, opening the door, we hold the witness. Jungkook turned toward the detective's corridor again, realizing that for the first time in the sequence, the narrative was no longer about Taehyung being attacked. It was about Taehyung being witnessed. And witness truth doesn't need rewritten notes. It needs survival long enough to speak. He had done that part already. Now the rest of them had to make sure the world didn't get the luxury of editing the quietest chapter anymore. Because the quietest chapter was no longer silent. It was awake. And awakening, once delayed too long, becomes the headline no misinformation firm can negotiate away anymore. This story had finally turned direction. Not toward rumor. Not toward denial. Not toward PR cadence. But toward ignition built from Taehyung's inhale fractures, finally stabilizing into recall instead of rumor. And recall, once it has a witness, becomes evidence the world can't stage manage anymore. That night, the hospital corridor was no longer a place of recovery. It was a checkpoint. And checkpoints are where stories finally stop being rewritten by outsiders and start being claimed by survivors who refuse narrative theft as a second assault genre. Taehyung was stable, but the story was no longer resting. It was rebooting into truth, one inhale at a time, calibrated by witnesses who had finally stopped looking at trauma like a scheduling liability and had started looking at it like a testimony waiting for permission from the right source. Permission would come, but it would come from Taehyung, not from tape. The investigation didn't wait for daylight. It waited for weakness, momentum, and the fragile window between silence and exposure. But Taehyung waking up had forced everyone's clocks to change. The enemy wasn't rushing anymore. They were adapting. When a crisis can't be buried, it evolves into diversion. When diversion fails, it mutates into defamation. And when defamation gets intercepted, it retreats into something more dangerous, narrative erosion. Slow, quiet, designed to make truth sound unstable without ever firing a shot. He had gone full analyst mode, pulling cross-tower pings, metadata fragments, and timing overlaps that suggested choreography, not coincidence. The case was beginning to smell like psychological intimidation disguised as external violence. Jungkook knew this genre too well, not from reports, but from watching how idle stories were edited, rewritten, polished, softened, or weaponized whenever trauma entered the frame. He had lived in the industry long enough to recognize the moment when pain stops being personal and starts being political. At hour 74, Taehyung was moved from induced rest into monitored consciousness. His ribs still protested every inhale, but his pulse had stabilized into something defiant enough to handle presence without collapsing into reaction. Jungkook finally allowed himself to breathe normally again, not because the danger was gone, but because Taehyung was finally strong enough to occupy the center of his own story without disappearing into sedation margins. The detectives returned, but this time they came without the containment rep. They already knew negotiation had lost its lane. "We have a suspect profile," the female detective said quietly. "Name it," Jungkook replied. "We can't yet." "Then it's not a profile, it's a draft," Jungkook countered. He stepped in again, tablet glowing like a tribunal screen. "We have sequence, motive, proximity, digital overlap, and defamation origin nodes," he said. "That's no longer profiling, that's causality." Tiang crossed his arms again. "If causality has no name, it still has intent." "And intent," Jungkook said, "is heavier than confirmation when the witness is alive to carry it." Taehyung's eyes opened again, clearer than before, exhaustion still present but no longer shapeless. "I remember," he whispered again, but this time the sentence didn't collapse. He turned toward him. "Do you remember the man in the balcony reflection?" Taehyung blinked slowly. Not his face, his timing. He moved before the glass broke, like he already knew impact was inevitable. Jungkook nodded. "That's not foreknowledge, that's coordination." The male detective finally spoke again. "We traced the defamation signal to a HYBE contractor access node, but routed externally to avoid internal audit flags.